When my mother said, "Don't come to Christmas dinner, it's too expensive for you," I thought I'd heard wrong. But then my sister sent a photo of the reservation under the caption, "Family only." I stayed silent. I watched, and on Christmas Eve as they laughed in my restaurant, I walked up to their table and said, "Welcome. Hope you don't mind the price." Their faces froze before the truth did. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The snow had been falling since dawn, soft and steady, painting the Seattle skyline in a pale shimmer. I stood in my office on the 22nd floor. The city stretched out beneath me, gray water glass towers and streaks of red taillights winding through the streets. It was almost 6 in the evening. The last meeting had ended, the staff had gone home, and the only sounds left were the hum of the heater and a faint Christmas melody coming from the lobby below. The expansion plans for the Los Angeles branch lay open on my desk, covered in my notes and coffee stains. I should have been excited. 7 restaurants in 12 years wasn't bad for someone who once served tables for tips. But instead of satisfaction, I felt the familiar weight of quiet loneliness that December always brought. When my phone lit up on the desk, I almost ignored it. Then I saw the name Mom. I froze. My mother rarely called. In fact, she never did unless something was wrong, or she had news she wanted to sound like good manners. I stared at the screen until the ringing almost stopped, then finally swiped to answer, Rachel. Her voice came through calm and perfectly measured, like she was reading from a script. "Hi, Mom." My own voice sounded smaller than I meant it to. "We're having Christmas dinner at Sterling Manor this year," she said quickly, as if she were confirming a business reservation. "It's the nicest place in town." Lauren made the arrangements. "You don't have to worry about attending." She thought it might not be comfortable for you. I knew what she meant by comfortable. I waited for her to add something, maybe a token kindness, but instead she continued, almost offhandedly. "It's an expensive venue, Rachel. You understand?" I closed my eyes. The snow kept falling outside, slow and deliberate, like time itself was stalling to listen. "I understand." I said finally, my voice even. "That's good," she replied. "Anyway, Merry Christmas, dear. Merry Christmas." Mom. The call ended before I could say another word. I stood there holding the phone, staring at the black screen. My fingers tightened until the plastic creaked. I wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of the pattern, tired of pretending it didn't sting every single time. 12 years since I'd left home, and still I was the one they looked at like a guest in their perfect little family, the one who didn't belong at their table. The city lights outside blurred as the snow thickened. I set the phone down and crossed the room, stopping by the wide glass wall that overlooked the bay. The water below looked silver in the streetlight, fairy horns echoing faintly from the distance. Seattle looked peaceful from up here, but I knew better. Peace was a luxury, and like most luxuries, it wasn't freely given. I picked up the mug of coffee on the windowsill and took a slow sip. The bitter warmth filled my throat. Somewhere in the building below, someone laughed. A janitor, maybe, or one of the chefs finishing prep for the holiday tasting menu. The sound was faint, but comforting, a reminder that some people still felt joy in December. I thought of Lauren, my perfect golden sister, the one who never had to fight for space. She probably spent the day shopping for matching dresses for her kids, maybe choosing the right wine for Sterling Manor. She'd always been the center of every gathering, Mom and Dad orbiting around her like planets around the sun. I'd stopped expecting invitations years ago, but somehow being deliberately excluded still cut deeper than silence. It wasn't about the dinner. It was about what it symbolized. I set the mug down and straightened the folders on my desk. Small motions to steady my hands. My office was spotless, all glass and polished wood, with framed photographs of each Coastal Harvest restaurant lining the wall. Every one of them bore my name on the founding plaque. I walked past them slowly, reading each name under my breath. Coastal Harvest Bellevue, Coastal Harvest Portland, Coastal Harvest Vancouver, and next year, Los Angeles. My family would never understand what it took to build them. The nights spent scrubbing floors after closing, the years working doubles the day I sold my car to pay a supplier. To them, success was inherited, not earned. I smiled to myself, not the bitter kind, but the quiet, determined kind. They wanted me out of their Christmas dinner because it was too expensive. Fine, let them have their Sterling Manor and their fine wine. They had no idea what table I was sitting at now, or the one I was about to prepare. I turned back to the window, watching the flakes swirl in the wind. The city shimmered like glass dust under the streetlights. Maybe this year I wouldn't spend Christmas alone. Maybe for the first time I'd stop wishing to be invited and start writing my own invitation. The thought warmed me in a way the coffee hadn't. I picked up my coat, switched off the lights, and whispered to the empty room, "Merry Christmas to me." The elevator doors closed behind me with a soft chime, and as I descended through the quiet building, I could almost hear my own heartbeat. Steady, unafraid, ready. The house on Hawthorne Lane looked like something out of a Christmas catalog that year. Every inch of it glowed. Strings of white lights wrapped around the porch columns, garlands looped along the railing, and a giant wreath hung proudly on the red front door. I can still smell the pine and cinnamon from the candles my mother loved to scatter across every table. Inside, laughter and the hum of conversation filled the air. My father stood near the fireplace shaking hands with neighbors, his whiskey glass catching the light. My mother moved briskly from room to room, adjusting table settings, correcting the help, ensuring the house looked magazine perfect. And as always, my sister Lauren stood in the center of it all, smiling, radiant, holding court. She had just graduated with a degree in interior design and was waving her diploma like a trophy. "It's official," she said to a family friend. "I'm going to start my own studio next year. Dad already offered to invest." Everyone applauded. My mother beamed as if she were the one with the degree. I watched from the dining room doorway wearing an apron and holding a stack of plates. "Rachel," my mother said without looking at me, "let the staff handle that. You'll wrinkle your dress." I didn't have the heart to tell her this wasn't one of my dresses. It was an old uniform from the cafe where I worked weekends, borrowed just to keep my clothes from getting dirty while I helped. "It's fine, Mom," I said softly. She frowned, half distracted, and turned back to her guests. From across the room, Aunt Linda caught my eye and smiled, kind but pitying. She turned to my mother and asked, "So what's Rachel up to these days? Planning to go back to school?" My mother didn't hesitate. Rachel's always been more of a hands-on person. "She enjoys the service industry, and I don't want to pressure her." The words landed like a pin dropping into water. Quiet, but sharp. I felt my face burn. I wasn't ashamed of working, but the way she said it, like I'd chosen to be ordinary, in a family allergic to ordinary, made me shrink. I busied myself setting silverware, pretending I hadn't heard. My father called out from the fireplace, "Lauren, come meet Mr. and Mrs. Harrison. They're looking for a designer for their new home." The room applauded again. My mother clapped the loudest. No one noticed when I slipped out the back door for a breath of cold air. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, soft flakes swirling in the porch light. The laughter from inside spilled out through the windows, warm, bright, unreachable. I stood there in the cold, rubbing my hands together. The scent of roasting turkey drifted through the air. It should have smelled like home, but it only reminded me how small I felt in that house. In our family, everyone had a role. Dad, the proud provider. Mom, the socialite. Lauren, the golden child. And me, the helper, the one always out of frame. I stayed out there until my fingers went numb, then returned inside. The house sparkled, guests mingling, wine glasses clinking. Lauren caught me near the staircase. "You missed it," she said, glowing. "Mom told everyone about my feature in Portland Living. They might even send a photographer next week." "That's great," I said, forcing a smile. She tilted her head. "You should really think about doing something with yourself, Rach. You're smart, but you keep hiding in these little jobs. You could at least take some business classes." Her words weren't cruel, not exactly, but they carried the same gentle condescension I'd been hearing all my life. I murmured, "I'll think about it," and turned away before she could see my eyes welling up. Later that night, after the guests left and the house grew quiet, I lay on my bed in the small room at the end of the hall. The faint sound of Christmas music drifted up from the living room. Lauren and Mom laughing again as they cleaned up together. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the paint, and thought about how far away my life already felt from theirs. I sat up, pulled out my laptop, and opened a job listing page. There it was, a small cafe downtown looking for part-time help. No experience required. I filled out the application before I could talk myself out of it. When I finished, I looked out the window. The snow was falling harder now, covering the driveway, the hedges, the roof of my father's car. The world outside seemed cleaner, quieter, like it was waiting for something new. I whispered to myself, "Next Christmas, I won't still be here." The following morning, I left early before anyone woke up. The suitcase I carried wasn't heavy, just clothes, a notebook, and a few saved tips from the cafe. The sky was gray, the ground slick with ice. As I reached the sidewalk, I heard the faint echo of Silent Night from a neighbor's radio. For a moment, I stopped and looked back. The house on Hawthorne Lane glowed behind me, warm and perfect, just as it always had been. Then I turned toward the bus stop, the cold biting at my cheeks, my heart steady. The snow fell harder, coating my hair and coat as I stepped into the streetlight, leaving behind the perfect family I was never meant to fit into. The first few months in Seattle felt like starting life on a blank page. The air smelled of salt and rain, the skyline faded into mist, and every morning I took the bus down to the harbor, where the mariner's table sat wedged between a seafood shack and a souvenir shop. It wasn't glamorous, peeling paint on the sign, a flickering open light in the window, but it was steady work, and it was mine. I learned quickly that the restaurant business was as much about rhythm as it was about food. The morning shift was quiet, the kind of silence that made you hear the clock tick and the seagulls cry outside. I wiped down tables, filled ketchup bottles, and listened to the waves slap the docks. By lunch, the fishermen came in, rough, loud, always paying in cash. Evenings brought office workers and couples who looked like they wanted to be anywhere but here. My uniform never quite fit right, the white shirt a size too big, the apron string constantly slipping loose, but I made it work. Every order was written neatly, every glass polished until it caught the weak amber light from the hanging bulbs above. If I was going to be a waitress, then I'd be the best one in Seattle. On my breaks, I sat near the kitchen door, eating soup that the cook, Benny, ladled for the staff. He was gruff, all tattoos and sarcasm, but he liked that I never complained. "You're different," he said once, slurping from his spoon. "Most kids your age quit after a week. You take notes." "I'm learning," I said. "Someday I'll run a place like this." He chuckled. "Aim higher, sweetheart. This place ain't much." He wasn't wrong. The mariner's table was struggling. I could see it in the nearly empty dining room, the slow nights, the owner's anxious face when he counted the register. One afternoon I stayed late to help him close. "You don't have to," he said. But I shook my head and started stacking chairs. "Your menu's too long," I blurted. He looked up, startled. "Excuse me. There are 20 pasta dishes. The kitchen only makes 4, well, you're spending too much on ingredients you don't use. And the lunch crowd, you're missing them completely because you don't open early enough." He stared at me for a long moment, then laughed softly. "You've been paying attention." "I can't help it," I said. "I watch patterns. It's like serving tables. You see what people leave on the plate, you know what's wrong before they say it." That night, I went home exhausted, but oddly proud. For the first time, I felt like my voice had weight. I wasn't just serving food, I was seeing the business. 2 weeks later, a new face started showing up at the corner booth near the window. A man in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair, sharp eyes, and a calm confidence. He always ordered the same thing, grilled salmon black coffee, and stayed longer than most reading reports on his tablet. The other servers whispered that he was one of those food investors scouting for new chefs. I didn't think much of it until one quiet Tuesday night. I was wiping the bar when he called out, "You're the only one who's still moving with purpose in here." I looked up, half smiling. "Habit, I guess. The place looks better when it's clean." He gestured around the empty room. "What do you think this restaurant's biggest problem is?" I hesitated, not sure if it was a trick. Then I said, "The menu's too long, the prices don't match the quality, and no one knows it exists. There's no reason for people to choose it over the place 2 doors down." His eyebrows lifted, and a faint smile curved his lips. "You've thought about this before. I see things," I admitted. "When I serve, I notice what people don't order. When I close, I see what food gets tossed. It's all right there." He nodded slowly. "And if it were yours, what would you do?" I took a deep breath. Cut the menu to 15 dishes. Make lunch affordable but keep dinner premium. Market to the office crowd nearby. They want fast service and good coffee. And maybe repaint the sign. Something modern but simple. The man leaned back, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "You remind me of myself 30 years ago," he said. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. "Michael Dawson," he said. "Dawson Hospitality Group. I own a few restaurants around the Northwest. I could use someone who sees what others miss." I stared at the card, the embossed letters catching the weak light. "I'm just a waitress," I murmured. He chuckled. "For now." I turned the card over in my hands, feeling the weight of it. Outside, the waves lapped softly against the pier. The wind rattled the glass panes, and the smell of salt filled the room. When I looked up again, he was already walking toward the door. His coat collar turned up against the cold. Before he left, he glanced back and said, Call me if you ever get tired of watching someone else's ship sink. The door closed behind him, and the bell above it chimed once, sharp and clear. I stood there for a long time holding the card, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, as I walked home through the wet streets, I repeated his words over and over. Maybe this was what a turning point felt like, quiet, unannounced, but undeniable. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd already decided, tomorrow I'd call. The next 3 years moved faster than I could have imagined. 1 minute I was still taking orders at Mariner's Table, and the next I was standing in a small rented office in Portland signing a partnership agreement with Michael Dawson. The company name, Coastal Harvest Group, was freshly printed at the top of the contract. My hands shook as I signed. "You're not just managing a restaurant," Michael said, setting down his pen beside mine. "You're building a culture. Remember that." I nodded, not trusting my voice. For the first time in my life, someone was looking at me as an equal, not as a kid trying too hard to prove she belonged. The first Coastal Harvest location opened in late spring. It was small, nothing fancy. 70 seats, reclaimed wood tables, soft lighting, and an open kitchen that smelled like rosemary and lemon butter. We hired 12 staff, most of them younger than me. I trained them myself, going over the service etiquette, food handling, how to talk to customers. "People don't come here just to eat," I told them. "They come to feel taken care of. Every plate, every greeting, every goodbye. It all tells them who we are." The first night was chaos. A full house delayed orders, a broken wine fridge, and one cook cutting his hand halfway through the rush. I barely had time to breathe. But when the last table left, I stood in the middle of the empty dining room and felt something I'd never felt before: pride. We made mistakes, sure, but we'd done it. The doors were open, and people had noticed. Within a month, reviews started rolling in, local blogs, small newspapers, then regional magazines. The words fresh, authentic, and welcoming kept appearing. Business picked up fast, and Michael was already talking about a second location. I worked 16-hour days. I managed inventory, trained staff, handled customer complaints, rewrote the menu, and designed new uniforms. I didn't sleep much, but it didn't matter. Every morning when I unlocked the front door and smelled coffee brewing, I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. One afternoon, as we were preparing for dinner service, Michael stopped by with his wife Diane. She was warm, kind-eyed, the type of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and brought cookies for the staff. She walked around the restaurant smiling. "You've made this place beautiful, Rachel," she said. I blushed, wiping my hands on my apron. "We've still got work to do," Michael laughed. "She's never satisfied. That's why I trust her." The weeks turned into months, and by December, we were thriving. The city lights glowed brighter at night, the sidewalks filled with bundled-up shoppers carrying red and green bags. I'd decorated the restaurant myself. String lights in the windows, garlands on the bar, candles on every table. It was my first Christmas away from family, and though part of me felt the ache of that absence, the rest of me felt calm, free. A few days before Christmas Eve, Diane called while I was checking invoices. "Michael told me you'll be working through the holidays," she said. "That's not right. You should at least have dinner with us." "I don't want to intrude," I said. "You won't be intruding," she insisted. "You're family now." Those words stuck with me the rest of the day. Family now. It had been years since anyone had said that to me. On Christmas Eve, I drove to the Dawsons' home in the suburbs of Portland. Their house was modest, glowing with soft yellow lights. The smell of baked ham and cinnamon filled the air when I stepped inside. The table was set for 4, Michael, Diane, their teenage daughter, Lily, and me. Dinner was simple but perfect. Conversation came easily. We talked about food trends, travel plans, and movies. Michael asked if I'd ever been to Europe. I laughed. "Not yet, but someday. Someday will come sooner than you think," he said. "You're too talented to stay still." After dinner, we sat near the fireplace with mugs of cocoa. The snow outside reflected through the window, soft and white. I hadn't realized until then how quiet a peaceful home could sound. Michael raised his glass slightly. "To our new family," he said. I smiled, my throat tightening. Diane squeezed my hand. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider. Before I left, Michael reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small black box. Inside was a brass nameplate engraved with the words, "Rachel Moore, Partner, Coastal Harvest Group, I couldn't speak. He said, "You've earned it. Every inch of this company has your fingerprints on it." I hugged them both before I drove away that night, the nameplate resting on the passenger seat beside me. The snow had stopped, but the streets still shimmered. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was chasing life. It felt like life had finally opened its doors and invited me in. By 2018, Seattle felt more like home than anywhere I had ever lived. Coastal Harvest had grown to 3 locations, each one busier than the last. Our Bellevue restaurant had just been featured in Northwest Gourmet magazine, with a photo of me standing in front of the bar, smiling, my name printed under the caption, "The Vision Behind the Harvest." I'd laughed when I first saw it. Embarrassed, but proud. Michael had framed the article and hung it in our office. That December, I was back at headquarters reviewing year-end reports when my phone buzzed. The name flashing on the screen made me pause. Aunt Linda. I hadn't heard from her in months. Rachel. She said the moment I answered, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't want to bother you, but your father's been having a rough time. He lost a large amount of money in some investment deal. Your sister's been helping with the bills." I straightened in my chair. "What about Mom?" "She's pretending everything's fine. You know how she is. But she's exhausted. I think she's embarrassed to tell you. I just thought you should know." When the call ended, I sat for a while staring at the blinking cursor on my computer screen. I should have felt detached. After all they'd built their lives around keeping me at a distance. But the thought of my mother worrying my father humbled. It pulled at me. I opened my phone and scrolled through the contacts until I found Mom. It had been months since we'd spoken outside of polite text messages on birthdays. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Rachel. "Hi, Mom. I just heard about Dad. Aunt Linda called. I wanted to see if everything's okay." Her pause was long. "Everything's fine. We don't need to trouble you, Mom," I said gently. "If you need help, I can—" "We're not taking handouts," she interrupted sharply. "Your sister and her husband have things under control." "It's not a handout," I said quietly. "It's family." Her tone cooled even further. "We're fine. You focus on your restaurants. That's what you're good at." And then before I could answer, the line went dead. For a moment, I just sat there, phone in hand, listening to the hum of the office heater. Outside the window, the city glowed, streets lined with Christmas lights, reflections rippling across the dark water of the bay. I pressed my forehead against the glass, watching the soft glimmer of the tree we'd set up in the lobby below. I used to think only family could hurt you like that. But in truth, disappointment can come from anywhere. Work, trust, ambition. The closer something sits to your heart, the deeper it cuts. I turned back to my laptop and reopened the monthly revenue reports. The numbers didn't make sense. The downtown branch had posted unusually high expenses, supply costs inflated by nearly 20% compared to last quarter. I cross-checked with the inventory logs. They didn't match. At first, I thought it was a data entry error. Then I noticed similar discrepancies in the payroll report, bonuses listed under employees who hadn't worked in months. My pulse quickened. I called Angela, our operations manager. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice calm, "can you explain the adjustments on the downtown accounts?" She hesitated. "What adjustments? The ones for vendor payments and bonuses. They don't align with our financial policy." "Oh," that she said, laughing nervously. "End-of-year corrections. We had to move some costs around for tax purposes." "It's fine." "I'd still like documentation," I said. "Of course," she replied too quickly. When the call ended, I leaned back in my chair, eyes on the city lights. There was a time when I would have taken her word for it, but that was before I'd learned that loyalty and honesty didn't always live in the same room. Michael stepped into the doorway just then, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You look like someone who's been doing math too long," he said, setting one down in front of me. I smiled faintly. "Something's off with the reports. I'll figure it out." He studied me for a moment. "You always do." When he left, I opened my email again. There it was. An automated alert from the accounting system, unauthorized access detected, downtown location. The timestamp matched Angela's login credentials. My stomach tightened. I clicked open the file, watching the numbers scroll down the screen. Hidden transactions, vendor names I didn't recognize, thousands of dollars routed to an external account. The glow from the Christmas tree in the corner flickered across the polished office floor. For a moment, I sat perfectly still, listening to the low hum of the city beyond the glass. Something was wrong inside my company, and I could feel it, like a faint crack running through something I'd worked years to build. I closed the laptop, exhaled slowly, and stared out at the night sky. The lights of the ferries moved across the dark water like slow, patient ghosts. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away. And deep down, I already knew. This time, the betrayal wouldn't come from the family I was born into, but from the one I had chosen. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, the air in Seattle had already turned sharp and cold, and the lobby of our headquarters smelled faintly of pine from the giant Christmas tree the staff insisted on putting up before Thanksgiving. Everyone was cheerful. Everyone except me. I'd been staring at financial reports for days, the same columns of numbers that didn't quite add up. It started small, an odd invoice here, a strange vendor there. I told myself it was clerical, but the deeper I dug, the more patterns appeared. Tiny shifts, hidden transfers numbers that seemed too neat to be honest. The signature on the authorizations was always the same, Angela Pierce, our operations director. Angela had been with me for 4 years. She was sharp, efficient, ambitious, almost too ambitious. I wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding. I wanted to, so I watched and waited. For a week, I stayed late after everyone left, checking her activity logs. One night long after midnight, I caught it, a file transfer. A data packet leaving our internal server routed to an outside email address I didn't recognize. My pulse pounded as I traced it back. The name that appeared on the screen made my stomach drop. Mark Holden, owner of the rival chain Harbor and Vine, the same man who'd tried to buy us out 2 years ago. I closed the laptop slowly, the glow of the monitor flickering against the window. Outside, snow was falling on the empty streets, soft and soundless. Betrayal doesn't make noise when it happens. It's only afterward that you feel the crash. The next morning, I called Angela into my office. She arrived smiling, holding a coffee cup as if nothing in the world was wrong. "You wanted to see me?" "Yes," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "Sit." I turned the laptop around so she could see the open file. The email records glowed on the screen, undeniable. Her smile faltered. "I don't know what this is," she began. "It's proof I cut in quietly. You sent confidential reports to Holden's group. Inventory, data vendor, pricing, performance metrics." She froze, color draining from her face. "Rachel, it's not what you think. He just wanted general figures, nothing sensitive. General figures don't come with line-by-line breakdowns of our cost margins," I said. My voice was calm even, but my heart hammered. "If you don't trust this company, you can leave. But you don't get to take what doesn't belong to you." For a moment, she looked like she might cry. Then her shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It was just business. I thought," he said. I raised a hand to stop her. "Save it." She nodded, tears welling, and stood. "I'll clear out my office." When the door closed behind her, the silence was suffocating. I'd built this company believing that loyalty meant something, but loyalty, I was learning, is a luxury too few can afford. Michael came by later, having heard the rumors. "So it's true," he said, lowering himself into the chair across from me. "You handled it." "She's gone," I replied. My voice was steady, but my throat ached. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "The world of business. Rachel can be as brutal as any family. Keep your head clear. Winning isn't about never getting hurt. It's about staying intact when it happens." I let out a quiet breath and nodded. "I understand." "Good," he said, standing. "And don't forget to protect what's yours. Trademark filing, security protocols, everything. Don't let anyone else get close enough to steal it again." After he left, I picked up my phone and called Emily Carter, our attorney. "Emily, it's Rachel. I need to review all our intellectual property protections. And maybe tighten access permissions." She didn't ask questions. "I'll have it ready by tomorrow," she said. When I hung up, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Outside the window, the Christmas tree lights reflected in the glass, tiny golden orbs flickering in the dark. I'd thought the holidays would feel easier this year. They didn't. Success came with a price, and sometimes it was the quiet loss of trust that hurt the most. I closed my laptop, finally ready to call it a night. The office was empty, the hum of the heater the only sound. I reached for my coat, but my phone buzzed again. A text from Melissa, our front desk manager. "Hey, Rachel. Just confirming a reservation for the 24th, 20 guests, 7 p.m. Private dining room at the downtown location. Name on the booking, Lauren Whitmore." For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen. Then slowly, I smiled. "Well," I murmured, setting the phone down on my desk, "isn't that poetic?" Outside, the snow kept falling silent and endless, covering everything in a thin, perfect layer of white. The week before Christmas, the office at Coastal Harvest buzzed with the kind of energy that only December could bring. The hallways were lined with red and white garlands, wreaths hung from glass doors, and the faint scent of cinnamon candles drifted through the air. My staff moved quickly, balancing holiday excitement with end-of-year exhaustion. I stood near the window, watching the people below hurry through the streets, their scarves whipping in the wind. In my hand, I held the week's reservation list. Melissa, our front desk manager, appeared at my office door holding a clipboard. "You're not going to believe this," she said, smiling a little. I turned from the window. "What's up?" "We just got a big booking for the 24th. Party of 20. Name on it is Lauren Whitmore. She's already prepaid the deposit." For a moment, I said nothing. The name hung in the air between us like a bell tone that refused to fade. Melissa hesitated. "I think that's your sister, right?" I nodded slowly. "Yes. She listed your parents on the guest list. The whole family's coming." I stared down at the reservation sheet, tracing the neat typeface of the name Whitmore Lauren. I felt my chest tighten, not from anger exactly, but from something quieter, something old. They picked the downtown location. Melissa continued. "Private dining room, 7 o'clock. Do you want me to?" "No," I interrupted softly. Then I smiled, small but sure. "No, let it be. They chose the right place." Melissa tilted her head, uncertain. "Are you sure you're okay with that?" "I'm more than okay," I said. "They don't know it yet, but this dinner's been a long time coming." After she left, I poured myself a glass of red wine from the small bar in the corner. The ruby liquid caught the light gleaming against the glass. I took a slow sip, the dry warmth spreading through me. I remembered my mother's voice from years ago. Sharp, careful, dismissive. "You wouldn't fit in at a place like that, Rachel. It's too elegant. Too expensive." I had laughed it off back then, though it had stayed lodged under my skin like a splinter that never healed. The irony now was almost poetic. Michael stopped by later that afternoon, his coat dusted with snow. "Melissa told me about the reservation," he said, closing the door behind him. "Lauren Whitmore. That's your family." "Yes." I leaned against my desk, arms crossed. He frowned. "Do you want me to cancel it?" "I can have someone call, say the space is overbooked." "No." I shook my head. "Let them come. They'll have a beautiful evening. I just want to see their faces when they realize where they're celebrating." He studied me, his expression unreadable. "You sure you want that?" "I don't hate them," I said quietly. "But I don't want their pity either. The truth has a way of setting things straight. Sometimes the fairest thing you can do is let it speak for itself." Michael smiled faintly. "You've grown sharper than me." "I had good teachers," I replied. He laughed, clapping a hand on my shoulder before leaving. When the door shut behind him, I sat at my desk for a long while, letting the stillness settle. Outside, the city glowed. Storefronts bathed in gold light, pedestrians carrying shopping bags, carolers singing faintly on the street corner. It all looked so peaceful, almost cinematic. But inside, my thoughts moved differently. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't angry. What I felt was more like inevitability, like watching the tide roll in after a long, patient wait. When evening came, I called the head of service, a young man named Caleb. For the 24th, I said I want the Moore family seated at the central round table. "The best one we have, crystal glasses, fine linens, the full-course menu." He jotted it down quickly. "Any special note for the nameplate, ma'am?" "Yes," I said, smiling to myself. "Print it elegantly. The Moore family. Center it in gold lettering." He nodded. "Got it." After he left, I stood and crossed the room to the window again. Snow was starting to fall, the kind that melted the instant it touched the ground. The reflection of my office lights shimmered faintly against the glass, and for a brief moment I could almost see my younger self. The girl standing outside a warm house, watching the laughter through the window, wondering what it took to be let inside. Now I was the one with the keys. I finished the last sip of wine and set the glass down carefully, hearing the faint chime as it met the wood. Then I turned off the lights, leaving only the glow from the Christmas tree in the corner. The ornaments flickered like stars against the dark room. I glanced once more at the reservation list on my desk, the name printed neatly at the top, Lauren Whitmore. The corner of my mouth lifted. "Welcome home," I whispered, though I wasn't sure whether I meant it for them or for myself. The restaurant glowed like a jewel that night. Every table was lit by soft candlelight, garlands of pine and gold ribbon wrapped around the columns, and the faint scent of cinnamon and mulled wine hung in the air. "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas" drifted through the speakers, the piano slow and elegant. From the upstairs office window, I could see everything. The polished silverware, the flicker of the fireplace, the shimmer of champagne glasses waiting to be filled. At exactly 7 o'clock they arrived. I saw them before they saw me, my father, Edward Moore, in his dark overcoat and perfectly knotted tie. My mother, Victoria, wrapped in white fur, her lipstick immaculate. And my sister, Lauren, stepping through the glass doors in a red velvet dress that caught the light with every movement. Behind them trailed her husband, Ethan, my Aunt Linda, and a cluster of cousins I hadn't seen in years. They spoke loudly, laughed easily, the kind of laughter that fills a room before kindness does. "The reviews were right," Lauren said as the host led them toward the main dining hall. "This place is absolutely stunning. It's the most exclusive restaurant in Seattle. Dad, you have excellent taste." My father chuckled. "I only choose the best." I felt my pulse slow, then deepen like a drumbeat I couldn't silence. I'd imagined this moment more times than I could count, but now that it was here, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like justice finding its way home. The host guided them to the central table, the one I'd personally chosen. Candles gleamed on the white tablecloth. The gold lettering on the place card read, "The Moore Family." From the mezzanine, I watched as they took their seats. My mother adjusted her napkin just so Lauren waved at a server to bring the wine list, and my father began boasting about his business contacts. "Apparently," Lauren said in a voice that carried across the room, "a few celebrities dine here regularly. I heard the executive chef trained in Paris. Oh, and Dad says someone important will be here tonight." She glanced around, smiling, unaware that her guess was truer than she knew. I descended the stairs slowly, the click of my heels lost under the music. My staff moved around me, polished and professional, pretending not to notice the tension gathering like static. As I reached the last step, I smoothed the front of my black dress and adjusted the badge pinned neatly to my chest. "Rachel Moore, Executive Director." Lauren noticed me first. Her eyes flicked up, confusion flickering into surprise. "Oh," she said brightly, "they've sent a new waitress. Perfect timing." The table turned to look. My parents froze halfway through their wine. I stopped beside them, smiling politely. "Actually," I said, my voice calm and clear, "I won't be serving you tonight." Lauren tilted her head, still smiling. "Too busy with other tables." "Too busy running the restaurant," I said. Silence rippled across the table like a wave. My father's face turned pale, my mother's lips parted slightly, and even the laughter from nearby tables seemed to fade. I rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair, the other brushing against my name badge. Lauren blinked. "Wait, you work here." I met her gaze. "I own it, along with 7 others. The sound of a fork dropping broke the silence. My Aunt Linda's eyes widened. "Rachel, dear, this is your restaurant." I nodded. "Yes, welcome to Coastal Harvest." My mother's voice came out in a whisper. "But you said you were still waitressing." "I am," I said softly. "I just didn't mention the title." Lauren's smile vanished, replaced by a flush of red climbing her neck. "You're lying. This can't be yours." I turned to her, still smiling, though there was nothing cruel in it. "You told me once I was too poor to sit at a table like this. But you were wrong. You just never looked close enough to see who was setting it." No one spoke. The only sound was the soft piano melody filling the air. My mother's hand trembled against her wine glass. My father's jaw tightened as he looked down at his plate. Aunt Linda recovered first. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "this is quite the surprise. You've built something remarkable, Rachel. Truly." "Thank you," I said gently. "Enjoy your evening. The truffle risotto is worth the price, though it might feel a little expensive." My gaze lingered on Lauren for a moment, just long enough for her to understand the echo of her own words coming back to her. Then I stepped away. From the far end of the dining hall, I turned once more. The candles flickered against the glasses, casting soft reflections on the window behind them. In the mirrored surface, I saw all their faces at once. Shock, pride, shame, awe, blurred together like colors bleeding through water. Under the golden lights, they looked smaller somehow, as if the years of judgment and distance had finally lost their shape. I climbed the stairs again, the murmur of the dining room swelling behind me. My hands were steady now. At the top, I paused by the railing, glancing down one last time. It struck me then how strange fate could be. Once I'd stood outside my family's home on Christmas Eve, watching their celebration through a window. And now, on another Christmas Eve, I was the one inside watching them from above. The snow outside pressed softly against the windows, melting into rivulets of silver. I breathed in the scent of wine and pine, and whispered to myself, not in triumph, but in quiet understanding. The lights below shimmered over the gold letters of my nameplate, and I thought this is what it feels like when life finally comes full circle. By the time dessert was served, the laughter in the dining hall had faded into small, uneasy murmurs. Most of the other guests had already left, leaving the room quieter, emptier. Only the soft hum of the piano remained, and even that sounded distant, like music coming from another world. My family sat at the large table in the center, the candles burning low, the wax pooling at their bases. No one seemed to know what to say. From my office upstairs, I could see everything through the glass wall overlooking the dining area. My reflection hovered faintly over theirs, the past and present blurring in the pain between us. They had spent years convincing themselves I would never be enough. And now, confronted by the life I built without them, they couldn't even look me in the eye. Aunt Linda broke the silence first. She leaned toward my mother and whispered, though the room was quiet enough that I could almost read her lips. "You know, Victoria, your daughter did something everyone thought was impossible." My mother didn't answer. She stared down at her glass, the rim stained with lipstick. My father's jaw tightened as he murmured, "Keep your voice down. We don't need a scene." Lauren sat motionless, her shoulders rigid, eyes unfocused. Ethan reached for her hand, but she pulled away. The servers moved around them discreetly, clearing plates, refilling water glasses, pretending not to notice the tension. It struck me how different this silence felt from the ones I used to sit through at our family dinners. Back then, silence meant invisibility. Tonight, it meant reckoning. I turned away from the window and sank into my chair, exhaustion settling in. The adrenaline from earlier had faded, leaving behind a calm, almost fragile stillness. My phone buzzed on the desk. The message preview read, "Jamie Ellis, Northwest Chronicle." I hesitated, then opened it. "Miss..."
More. It began. A video from tonight's dinner has gone viral. Someone filmed the moment you revealed your ownership. Social media is calling you the daughter banned from Christmas dinner. Everyone's talking about you. Care to comment? I stared at the screen, then exhaled through my nose, half amused, half weary. Of course someone had recorded it. In the age of hashtags and headlines, nothing stayed private for long. I typed a reply, then deleted it before sending. Instead, I whispered to myself, "They'll tell the story however they want. I don't need to." Setting the phone down, I leaned back and let my head rest against the chair. The soft hum of the building filled the room. Somewhere below, the servers laughed quietly as they reset tables for the next day. Outside, the snow was falling again, coating the streets in white. I unbuttoned my blazer, suddenly aware of how tight my chest felt. The lights in my office dimmed automatically, and the reflection of the dining room below grew softer, less distinct. I watched as my mother finally stood, touching the back of her chair for balance. My father rose beside her. Aunt Linda dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, while Lauren sat perfectly still, her face pale. As they gathered their coats, I walked closer to the glass wall. From this distance, they couldn't see me. They never had. But for once, I didn't need them to. When I was younger, I used to dream of this moment, of making them see me, of proving them wrong. But now that it was here, all I felt was an ache where the anger used to be. Vindication wasn't victory. It was simply the end of wanting anything from them at all. Down below, Aunt Linda reached for my mother's arm and said something that made her pause. My mother turned toward the table one last time, eyes glistening in the low light. Her lips moved, barely audible. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. But by then I was already walking away. I went back to my desk, switched off the last lamp, and stood in the doorway for a moment before leaving. The glow from the Christmas tree near the reception desk painted the hallway gold. The scent of pine and clove hung in the air. I slipped on my coat, the wool brushing against my hands, and took one last look at the restaurant through the glass. My family was gone. Only empty chairs remained. The table cleared, the candles still flickering faintly, their flames small but steady. Outside, the snow had thickened. It fell in soft waves under the streetlights, blanketing everything in silence. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and as the doors closed, I caught my reflection once more. Tired, calm, and finally free. The morning after Christmas was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavier than silence.
Seattle was blanketed in snow, soft and white, muffling every sound outside my window. From my office at Coastal Harvest headquarters, I could see the flakes drift past the glass, melting as they hit the warmth of the pane. The only light came from the Christmas tree in the corner, its ornaments reflecting the soft gold of early morning. I hadn't planned to work, but habit had brought me here anyway. The staff were home with their families, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't mind being alone. I sat behind my desk sipping coffee gone cold, reviewing notes for our upcoming New Year's menu, when I heard the soft knock at the door. When I looked up, my mother was standing there. For a moment, I thought I was imagining her. Wrapped in a gray wool coat, a small gift box in her hands, eyes uncertain. She hadn't set foot in any of my restaurants before. "Mom," I said quietly. She hesitated at the doorway. "I didn't mean to interrupt. Your assistant said you were here." I gestured toward the chair across from me. "Come in." She walked slowly as though unsure if she was allowed to. She placed the box on my desk, a small, square package wrapped in red paper, the kind she used to keep for last-minute gifts. Her hands trembled slightly. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," she began. "For last night. For everything, really. I should have been proud of you years ago." I stayed silent, waiting. She took a shaky breath. "Lauren, she's always been fragile when it comes to you. She hides it under confidence, but she's been afraid you'd outshine her, that you'd prove her wrong." Her words landed softly like snow on glass. I looked at her face, older than I remembered the lines, deeper the polish dimmer. "Mom," I said finally, "I don't need anyone to lose for me to win. I never did. I just wanted to be part of the family without having to earn it." Her chin trembled. Then she reached across the desk, her hand covering mine. "You are Rachel. You always were. I just didn't know how to love you right." For the first time in years, I saw tears slip down her cheeks. I stood, walked around the desk, and pulled her into an embrace. She was shaking, whispering apologies I'd already heard in her silence the night before. I held her for a long moment, feeling her heartbeat against mine. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something quieter, something like peace. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It only keeps it from pulling you under. When she left, the office felt strangely lighter. The little red gift box sat unopened on my desk. I didn't need to know what was inside. The gesture itself was enough. That night I went home early. Snow still fell in lazy spirals outside the tall windows of my apartment. I poured a glass of wine and sat on the couch watching the city lights blur against the storm. For the first time in years, Christmas didn't feel like a wound reopening. It just felt like a day ending. 3 days later, I was back at the office when the TV in the lobby caught my attention. A breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. "Local businessman under federal investigation for tax fraud. Ethan Whitmore." The footage showed Lauren's husband being escorted out of a downtown office building, cameras flashing. My stomach tightened. Before I could reach for the remote, my phone started ringing. Lauren's name lit up the screen. "Rachel," she said the second I answered, her voice shaky and high-pitched. "They're saying Ethan's company falsified financial records. We're being sued. The bank froze our accounts." "Oh my God. I don't know what to do." "Calm down," I said. "Where is he now?" "With his lawyer," she cried. "But they're talking about criminal charges. We're going to lose the house." Please, can you help us? You know people, right? You have lawyers, money, something." "Rachel, I'm begging you." I pressed a hand to my forehead. The city glowed outside my window, cold and indifferent. "Send me the documents," I said after a long silence. "I'll have my legal team look at it." "Thank you," she said quickly. "You don't know how much this means. But I'd already hung up. I sat back in my chair, staring out into the night. The reflection of the skyline shimmered against the glass, so many lights, each one bright for a moment before fading into the fog. A part of me wanted to help. Another part whispered that this was exactly the balance life brings when pride turns into cruelty. I watched the snow fall slow and relentless until the city disappeared behind the white haze. Somewhere in that quiet, I realized that forgiveness and fairness aren't always the same thing. And I wasn't sure yet which one I owed my sister. 3 months passed before the case went to court. By then, the headlines had already faded, replaced by new scandals, new names. But for Lauren and Ethan, the storm hadn't passed. Their faces still appeared in the papers every few days, followed by words like fraud investigation and charges pending. The morning of the hearing, Seattle was gray and wet, the kind of day where the rain felt like ash instead of water. I stood on the courthouse steps beside my attorney, Emily Carter, watching the media swarm the entrance. Cameras flashed as Lauren and Ethan stepped out of a black sedan. They looked immaculate, polished in a way that only desperation could produce. Lauren wore a cream coat, her hair pinned perfectly, but her hands shook as she clutched Ethan's arm. He kept his eyes down. "Are you ready for this?" Emily asked quietly. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said. "Let's just make sure the truth gets told." Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of coffee and damp wool. I took a seat behind the defense table a few rows back. Reporters whispered along the side aisles, pens poised. Lauren caught my eye only once, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face when she realized I was there. The judge entered the room, rose, and the proceedings began. The prosecution outlined its case quickly. Tax evasion, falsified statements, corporate deceit. The words came fast, heavy, all too familiar. From every story I'd ever read about men like my father or Ethan. Men who believed rules bent for those who smiled the right way at the right people. When it was our turn, Emily stood calm and deliberate. "Your Honor," she said, "we're not denying that mistakes were made, but what the evidence shows is that Mr. Whitmore was not the architect of this scheme. He was the scapegoat." She handed a folder to the clerk. Inside were the records my team had uncovered. Emails, bank transfers, correspondence from Ethan's partners who had orchestrated the fraud and pinned it on him when the IRS began asking questions. I'd found them through an old contact from the Hospitality Association, someone who owed me a favor. It wasn't about saving Ethan. It was about making sure the scales balanced, even if that meant tipping them in favor of someone who'd once looked down on me. The judge reviewed the files, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor frowned, scanning through copies of the documents. After 20 tense minutes, the ruling came down: partial exoneration, reduced fines, probation. Not freedom exactly, but enough to keep them from losing everything. The gavel struck, and it was over. Outside, the press was waiting, microphones thrust forward like bayonets. I moved through them quietly, head down, letting Emily handle their questions. My car was parked near the curb, engine running. But before I reached it, I heard Lauren calling my name. "Rachel." I turned. She was running toward me, her heels slipping slightly on the wet pavement. Her makeup was starting to run, mascara streaking faintly beneath her eyes. When she reached me, she grabbed my arm. "You saved us," she said breathlessly. "You saved him." "Why?" I looked at her, the city lights reflected in the puddles between us. "Because justice isn't the same as revenge," I said. "And if you've learned anything from this, then maybe it was worth doing." Her lips parted, but no words came. Behind her, Ethan stood by the courthouse doors, his face pale and drawn. My father was there too, a few steps behind him, silent, for once, his expression unreadable. He looked smaller than I remembered. Lauren's voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," I said. "Just don't waste the second chance you've been given." She nodded, eyes glistening, and stepped back. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt fragile, heavy with things that would never be said. My father finally spoke, his voice low. "You did the right thing, Rachel." I didn't answer. Maybe I didn't need to. I turned and walked toward my car, the red taillights glowing faintly against the gray street. The rain had started again, soft at first, then steadier. In the reflection of a shop window, I saw Lauren standing under her umbrella watching me. As I opened the door, I caught one last glimpse of her turning back toward Ethan, slipping her arm through his. They disappeared into the crowd of reporters, swallowed by the blur of umbrellas and flashing cameras. I got into the car, closed the door, and let out a long breath. The windshield wipers began to sweep rhythmically across the glass. Clearing the rain in steady arcs, winning doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it's just walking away with your integrity intact, while others are still trying to find theirs. I leaned back, watching the city lights blur through the rain. The courthouse loomed behind me, its windows glowing faintly through the mist. Justice had been served imperfectly, but honestly. And for the first time, I realized that was enough. A year passed before I realized how far I'd come. December returned to Seattle, dressed in white, the streets glittering beneath strings of lights, the air crisp and full of possibility. That night, the flagship Coastal Harvest restaurant glowed brighter than any building on the block. Through the tall windows, the chandeliers shimmered, laughter spilled out into the cold, and the band inside played an old jazz version of Silver Bells. It was our annual Christmas gala, the biggest one yet. We had nearly 200 employees now spread across 5 cities. Chefs in crisp uniforms mingled with managers, hosts, and servers, everyone dressed in their best. The smell of roasted herbs and champagne hung in the air, and I could feel the hum of something deeper than pride. It was belonging. I moved through the crowd, slowly shaking hands, exchanging smiles. Every face I passed represented a story, a risk, a piece of the dream I had built from scratch. "You did it, Rachel," someone said as I passed. "You built something real." At the center of the room, Michael and Diane waited with glasses of wine in hand. When they saw me, Michael's face broke into a wide grin. "Look at this," he said, sweeping a hand toward the room. "You've gone farther than we ever imagined." Diane hugged me tightly. "You've made this place feel like family. That's rarer than success, you know." Their words warmed me more than the wine ever could. I looked around again, the room full of life, light, and laughter, and thought about how different it all felt from the nights I used to spend serving strangers just to keep the lights on. Later that evening, as speeches began, I stood near the stage, listening to the applause that followed each toast. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw my mother and Aunt Linda step through the front entrance. They looked hesitant, like they weren't sure they belonged. My mother carried a bouquet of white lilies, the same kind she used to put on our dining table every Christmas when I was a kid. I walked over and smiled. "You came." My mother's eyes softened. "We wouldn't have missed it. This is extraordinary, Rachel." I took the flowers from her and hugged her gently. Aunt Linda patted my arm, whispering, "Your father wanted to come, but he thought he'd just get in the way. He's proud too, even if he'll never say it." I laughed quietly. That sounds like him. For the first time, there was no weight in our silence, just peace. We stood there for a while listening to the music and the sound of people clinking glasses. An hour later, one of the servers approached me with a small envelope. "This was delivered for you, Ms. Moore." I opened it. Inside was a Christmas card handwritten in neat looping cursive. "Rachel, I couldn't bring myself to face you tonight, but I want you to know that I see you now. You were never the failure I made you out to be. You've built something beautiful, and you did it without hate. You deserve everything you've achieved. Love, Lauren." I traced the ink with my thumb, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. Some wounds don't close completely, but they stop bleeding eventually. As the night wound down, I slipped away from the noise and stepped out onto the balcony. The city below sparkled under a gentle snowfall. From here, the sign on the building glowed softly. "Coastal Harvest, owned by Rachel Moore." I leaned against the railing, the chill of the metal seeping through my hands. Inside, the band began playing "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas." The melody drifted out into the cold air, mingling with the snowflakes that landed in my hair. I thought about everything that had led me here, the long nights, the rejection, the silence, the small acts of kindness that kept me moving forward. It wasn't revenge that built this life. It was persistence, love, and the quiet refusal to disappear. I raised my glass toward the skyline, my reflection shimmering faintly in the glass door behind me. "If you've ever been pushed out of a room, don't worry," I said softly. "Sometimes the best thing they ever did was close the wrong door, so you could find the right one." The city lights blurred slightly through the falling snow, and I smiled. "If you were ever cut out of the table, remember, sometimes what they take away only helps you discover where you truly belong." I took a sip of wine, the warmth spreading through me as the music swelled from inside. "Merry Christmas." I whispered to no one in particular, and to everyone who had ever felt the same.